Well, I see that the hall is filling up. Anyway, thank you for this panel. It's a very hard panel to do because basically the kinds of things we cover start with, say, artificial intelligence, say moving on to automatized weapons, to hacking, to disinformation, to deep fakes. It's all digital. And so one of the problems I have with panels that just talk about all of this is that things kind of float from one to another. On the other hand, I would argue, and this is sort of the basis of, I think, this panel, is that until the new millennium, war and conflict was essentially kinetic. Following Newton's second law, force equals mass times acceleration, where acceleration is distance divided by time squared. The problem that we have faced in the new millennium is that we have threats that have no mass, they have no distance, they have no time. Or, to put it differently, Tallinn, Torino, Toronto, Topeka, Toronto, Tokyo, and Taipei are all equidistant, which is very different from the way we have conceptualized conflicts up till now. And even when it comes to NATO, let's keep in mind, NATO is it's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, not because we are also wonderful and Japan is not, or South Korea is not. It's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization because of bomber range, fighter refueling, troop transport, tank logistics. That's why it's a regional, it's a kinetic-based organization. Whereas now we are in a new situation where serious conflicts and serious threats come in a way that there is no distance, there's no time, which I suggest also means that we need new forms of cooperation, of alliances even that are not the traditional geographically based alliances that we have. And in fact, I would argue, can be much more values based than they have been up till now, since, I mean, you know, Japan is not in NATO, South Korea is not in NATO, but certainly we're dealing with liberal democracies that are under threat. They may not always have the same people threatening them, but nonetheless they are liberal democracies, and what we require is a new way of looking at security in this digital era. Now, my task here is to ask my co-panelists here either to tell me I'm full of it, or to argue against it, or to actually say where the threats lie, and then I will also tell you some of the threats as I see it, but nonetheless, what are these threats? And I will begin with being polite, with Alina. You can go first.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, President Ilves. And I'm really delighted to be back at the Leonard Mary conference and seeing so many old friends and making new friends. It's been a really fantastic day of conversations already. If I can, I'm going to make 3 points to get us started in the conversation, starting from 30,000 feet and then going down to what's happening in the non-kinetic space and what's not happening in the non-kinetic space in the war in Ukraine. So first, I completely agree with you, President Ilves. I think we often talk about the non-kinetic ecosystem in silos. So there's a huge amount of work and conversations on disinformation. Then there's conversations on the future of artificial intelligence, and you can just go on and on. But in fact, we are very much in a pre-Cambrian moment in the evolution of technology. And what I mean by that is those of you who remember the Cambrian period in evolution, this was a moment when all these simple life forms suddenly started to come together and form more complex life forms. That's actually where we are today when it comes to many of the technologies we're talking about, whether it comes to genetic engineering, robotics, biotech, AI, the uses of data for other means besides, things like deep fakes, which I think have been really deeply overblown. And what that means is that we're at the very tip of the iceberg when it comes to understanding not just how the world and societies will be transformed once these technologies start to fit together, once you have AI, robotics, and biotechnology and genetics all fitting together. It's a future that is very difficult to imagine, I think, for most of us today. But this future is coming. Some of it's already here, and it's already transforming the future of war and the future of conflict. And this is where my second point is that we really need to think about not regulation of these technologies, but how do we continue to deploy and harness these technologies and define the rules of the game so that countries like China and Russia don't define it for us. I don't think we mentioned the fact that there is the Trade and Technology Council meeting that's happening, I believe, tomorrow, that is supposed to be kind of the Europe-US answer to China, primarily. Now, of course, it's talking about Russia as well. But to my mind, we are so late and we're lagging so far behind. And Europe and the US are actually on very different trajectories when it comes to thinking about how we use technology, what are the privacy issues around technology, et cetera. Of course, countries like China don't care about data privacy, and in fact, have a system that is modeled exactly against protecting the privacy of individuals. So my concern is that we haven't fully understood what the future is going to give us once all of these different research streams start to come together. But we're already trying to regulate that future today. And we don't actually have agreement between the US and the EU on so many of these issues, primarily being data, data privacy, data exchange, the use of AI, et cetera. So that's kind of the big picture, is that we're really late. We need much more cooperation. And yes, we absolutely need to think beyond the transatlantic space, because frankly, in the EU-US relationship, which is what the TTC focuses on, the US is the innovation powerhouse. No offense to European countries that want to think of themselves as innovation technology hubs. Estonia is, but it's perhaps too small to matter on the global stage like the US. But if you look at where technology, obviously technology companies have come from, that are now the big tech companies that we sometimes get really angry about, how they do things like moderation of content, and Elon Musk buying Twitter and all of that is very top of our mind. But these companies came from the United States. And yes, we want to reproduce that kind of innovation in other democracies, but we really need to be thinking about how do we induce innovation before we start to clamp down, I think, on technology more broadly. So that's the 30,000-foot view, is that we're really far behind. Unfortunately, I think, to my mind, cooperation on technology in particular is the biggest divisive issue right now in the Transatlantic Alliance. We've all been talking a lot about the increased cooperation on defense and security. So I think there, if I can give American grades, which I may have to translate to a European audience, to how the alliance is doing, on defense and security, I think the alliance gets an A right now, which is, I think, a 5 in the European system. On political values, I think we're probably somewhere around a B-, because we all know the problems we have with countries like Hungary. But then when we come to technology cooperation, which to my mind is what is defining the future of the global order, we're probably at a C. And so these are the issues we really need to be thinking about. The last point I'll make is specifically about Russia and Ukraine. I think many of us have been surprised by the dogs that didn't bark when it comes to Ukraine and Russia. And that is the cyber domain, of course. Yes, there have been massive cyber attacks against Ukraine. We know that. Ukraine has proven itself to be very resilient. I would say Ukraine is winning the information war as well when it comes to disinformation, but not globally. Again, within the West, but not across the global South. And I've been surprised to see that there haven't been massive cyber attacks yet on Western countries from Russia. So I think that tells us also a little bit about how we think about the marriage between kinetic and non-kinetic capabilities, and the reality that perhaps countries like Russia can't do a war on both fronts, meaning in the kinetic and non-kinetic space. So I think these are some of the things that have come to light as the war has begun in Ukraine in February. And these are some of the things that I just want to start having the conversation about.
Great. Before I go on, I will clarify that one point, which is and where cyber differs from kinetic, is that you don't know if you have been subjected, or the public does not know.
Right.
There have been considerable and rather major amelioration efforts against ongoing cyber attacks, even in this country, that have not debilitated us the way they did, say, 15 years ago in 2007 when we weren't expecting it. But there's been a steady ongoing attack, but you don't notice it because we've figured out how to deal with it. Let me go on to the minister. Where's the minister? Here's the minister. And the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Czech Republic, but who is also quite the digital person. Please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for invitation to this great conference. Thank you very much for organizing it, and thank you very much for this very timely pickup topic. We are living in extraordinary times. We are living in times where the international order itself is under brute force attack from Putinist Russia. And what does it mean for this debate about digital issues? The meaning is that the international order in a consistency we knew for decades was established after the Second World War, when the UN and the Charter of UN was established, written down with the ban of attack war, and it was the time when the international community decided that we won't be waging wars on each other to each other, so we will be able to sit at one table and solve problem through diplomacy, not through war, and that we won't be eating each other. That's the very basic principle of UN Charter, which is now under attack. And this UN Charter serves as a baseline for many, really many agreements, which are also important for regulation and for the way how the international community together is able to solve issues. And it was said in the very beginning, cybersecurity, cyberspace is global. There's no difference between Prague, Tallinn, Tokyo, Washington. It's in milliseconds, the distance and the time. So it's instant. And how we can shape this international space, how we can regulate it, how we can to be discussing norms, if the very fundament of the whole thing is in danger. So that's my first question. And we don't know what will be the result of this horrible war in Ukraine. And I'm sure that everyone who is there and everyone who is watching wishes the best for Ukraine. The Czech Republic wishes the best for Ukraine. I know that Estonia is doing much. Thank you very much for that. The whole Western society. And Western hackers. And I think it is one of the interesting points of that. There's a ton of leaked information from Russian sources because the Western hackers are against Russia. So this is also one of the activist part of this whole thing. But maybe to answer more, to put more food for thought in this debate. I think for the security of Europe and what I call Western world, for the security of NATO, EU, transatlantic relationship, we need to be looking for solution on the level of NATO, EU, maybe OECD. OECD is the platform which is finally able to find a way how to, in a proper way, tax digital companies like Google or Uber, which are also doing their business globally. So I am a little skeptic about, for example, ITU able to solve the issues, but it should be also one of our tasks to be very active in UN and try to, for example, lessen the Chinese influence, because of course we know, it's a well-known fact that the China, Russia, they have very different view how human rights, especially in digital space, should be treated. And let me just mention that one of a key topic of our Czech presidency, upcoming Czech presidency to the EU, will be Indo-Pacific region, and one of those topics there is the resilience of Indo-Pacific, exactly because of China taking on issue on digital issues. And yes, we are in some kind of digital transformation, and we need to have some guidelines how to transform the whole society, how to transform regulations. And one of the very key principles of the Czech foreign policy is not to forget about human rights. And in the very beginning of my speech, when I was speaking about UN Charter, part of these founding documents are also fundamental human rights issue, and human-centered approach to new technologies. So there is a strong, like-minded group of countries, Western countries. So we are bringing up this issue. We need to bring more actors into debate about that. We have multiple stakeholders, not only states. We need NGOs to be part of this debate. We need companies to be part of this debate, because companies are the ones who are creating these digital innovations, but they are also carrying a huge part of responsibility, since the specific IT system in banks industry, in energy industry, transportation industry, once they are under attack, they can disable the very basic critical infrastructure. So we have many topics to discuss: cybersecurity, data protection, internet censorship, shutdowns, spread of misinformation through digital channels, digital capacity. It's not something given that you have enough bandwidth, for example, in certain situation. I think the Ukraine situation shows that thanks to Elon Musk and his project, Ukraine's forces can have access to internet. So it's one very good specific example hitting headlines, because everything with Elon Musk immediately gets in the front page of newspapers, even the serious ones. So we have these topics, and for me, I have one indicator. What is the trending topics? What is a trending topic? Reading those boring conceptual documents, strategies, conception, etc. There is always long list of things which are necessary, which are important topics, and I always look at the last one, because I know that was the last edit to that long list. And for a long time, the cybersecurity was the last word in this list. And in last 2-3 years, the new emerging technologies became the last part of the last thing in this paragraph. And of course, it means a lot of things. We don't need to go into that. But of course, the digital is a very integral part of that. So I don't want to be long much. We are doing conference on Prague Cybersecurity Conference in Prague, which will be held in autumn. So you are most welcome, and we will have more place to discuss these issues here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I should say that just so we know how new things are, in 2007, when we had the first cyber attack, that could be defined in Clausewitzian terms of the war is the continuation of policy by other means in the first state-on-state attack that took place against this country right here when we went to NATO, and NATO said, well, a number of countries said, you don't know what you're talking about, and this was said by countries that couldn't tell the difference between a toaster and a laptop. And the first ever cybersecurity panel at the Munich Security Conference took place in 2011, just so you know how things go. But things have moved on, and we've moved on to the Jedi Knights, as it were. And we now have André Loesekrug-Pietri, if I pronounced that correctly, who's heading the Joint European Disruptive Initiative, also known as JEDI, and perhaps you can say a few words.
Yeah, thank you, President. Let me start with a quote that probably most of you know. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is the one we are willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intended to win. That was September 62 in front of Rice University. The US had almost no clue how to go to the moon. 7 years later, 7 years, they achieved that goal. We are more or less in the same situation. So what I want to say is that this topic of strategic surprise, like the digital realm, you talked about all these technologies, Toomas, Mr. President, they are the same kind of challenge we are facing. So you asked me to present, but that's not the purpose. What we are doing at JEDI, we're trying to create the equivalent to the DARPA, so the Advanced Research Project Agency here in Europe. And the big misunderstanding about DARPA in Europe is that it's all about billions. And as you know, for most of politicians, the quality of your policy is the level of billions you put in. And I'm going to throw just an idea for you to reflect upon, and I'm a French and German, so you pick the side you dislike the less. But, you know, and I don't know who was the toaster person, but I fear to know.
One half.
It's the EU, and I'm a genetic European, put 200 billion in R&D since '84, since it's a competency of the EU. DARPA, in current euro terms, put 50 billion since 1958. 50 billion, 200 billion, 62 years, 35 years. The only and where are the technological leadership aspects of Europe? In semiconductors? Not really. In space? Not really. In AI? Not really. In biotech and genetic engineering? Not really. In quantum, jury is still out. What I want to say is that that is a big policy, a massive policy failure. And it's not about to blame things, but it's about having dreams of changing that. And I don't want to go into the detail of different technologies. That's probably the purpose of the discussion. But we have 3 dreams. And JEDI is now pretty big with more than 5,000 people participating all over Europe. First, that we put anticipation and foresight at the core of our policies. Look at what happened in the last couple of years. We had, obviously, the rise of China. We woke up because basically China bought a very well-known German robotic company, but it took us 15 years to understand what's going on. The pandemic caught us by surprise. I don't want to repeat the story of Bill Gates, but it was the CIA, actually, in 2008 that mentioned that, and even George W. Bush mentioned that. So just to tell you that anticipation is not always that hard. And you mentioned this panel is called Computer World. Computer World is from 1981, and I encourage you to listen to that Kraftwerk point. It's about intelligence, data, CIA, healthcare. I mean, all the topics are there. It's just a question of effort. And I was very happy when I heard Ursula von der Leyen in 2019 in her speech said, we want to put foresight at the core of our policies. and we keep being caught by surprise. And not to flatter the Estonian or Baltic audience here, but I mean, what's happening in Ukraine has been basically told by our Baltic states and friends and Nordic friends more or less since 10 years. And we have, in the European project, for whatever reason, we are not able to capture that diversity that helps to be very good in foresight. The second dream is that, you know, again, Kennedy, for space science like nuclear science, that's for our German friends, and technology has no conscience of its own. Whether it will become a force for good or ill depends on man. So we need to shape the future, and I'm with you, Alina, is that if you're permanently, and I'm not anti-regulating, at the contrary, I think we've been very naive in Europe for too long. But if you only play defense, you will always be shaped by others. And let's listen, and I'm not a Brexiter, by what the UK people told us. They want to take control. But if we're not shaping events, and technology is shaping the way our public opinions, our warfare is done, increasingly others will set the agenda. And I personally don't want the agenda to be set either in Beijing or in Palo Alto. And you mentioned, Minister, and you're totally right, we need to be able to go different ways. You mentioned about hackers. And I'm sure that once this Ukraine crisis is over, the hackers will go back in their little hole, which is we don't really want to mess with them. The foundations and the NGOs that are so important, people like Jedi, like us, we've been proposing a project on deep fakes since the last 2 years. Even Merkel spoke about that. Boris will remember Emmanuel Macron when he went to the MSC in 2020, he did, out of his 10-minute speech, 2 full minutes on deep fakes. And then you go to the government and say, then they tell us, oh yes, we need to launch a public call that will last 12, 18, 24 months. This kind of way our administration is working needs to change. Otherwise, we will increasingly be shaped. I mean, we're almost lucky that Xi is getting himself in a hole, but that's an opportunity probably for the Europeans to move forward. And then last but not least, my last dream is we need to reinvent our relationship with time, because the digital and time, you mentioned about distance, you're totally right. The other thing, and again, Minister, you mentioned about milliseconds, is no, we don't have time. When I hear a European Commissioner saying democracies are just slower than others, I think if we have this idea in the head, we are dead. We need to reinvent the way speed is going on in democracies. We did not reopen GDPR, which is totally, completely unused. How many of you clicked at least 5 times since this morning on I accept the cookies and no, not reading the small line? So it's not working. What I want to say is that we need to make regulation like pop-up regulation. We need, yes, we celebrate DMA and DSA, these are Digital and Market Act and Service Act, which took 18 months, much faster than before. The problem is not to be much faster, it's to be faster than the others. So we need regulation to come up at the same speed as technology. And we need to be able to upgrade it, have sunset clauses. I mean, it's a little bit process I'm talking about, but I think the research, the competencies, people forget that the first chief scientist of SpaceX was German, that the guy who won the DARPA challenge on mobility was Sebastian Thrun, also German, that Siri, which was a project won by Stanford Research Institute, SRI, was a French guy. So you have all these competencies here in Europe, and I'm having a little bit Europe-centric discussion. The question is, how do we liberate this energy at the moment where we are under attack? And I think this is something which is probably reinventing this digital challenge that is posed to us is a huge opportunity. And I don't understand on the energy front, and I'm going to finish on that, how come we don't use that. I heard this breakfast this morning, and I heard about plans on 5 years and 10 years and LNG, etc. I think we just lack the creativity at the policy-making level of saying, like we did with vaccines, why don't we succeed in energy transition in 12 months and 18 months and not beg, Qatar. I think seeing a green minister begging Qatar gas, I think, is a challenge for me as a German. And so that cannot happen because we're going from one dependency to another. So that's my third dream, is that we reinvent and read that. Otherwise, we will have an increased level of population that will find that in the digital world, democracy is just not delivering. And I think that is the biggest fear for all of us.
Thank you. Before I do two things, I will just point out that I'm not so sure Europe understands the security aspect of, I mean, you mentioned DMA. I mean, DMA was done with with the 20th century competition regulation and completely ignored digital security issues, reducing security instead of increasing it, because it wasn't, and I would say just for the EU, I mean, just as in the European Union, all legislation has to be vetted for its effect on climate. We ought to get to the point where all legislation is vetted for digital security, because right now it is not being done, and DMA may be a very nice way of screwing the Americans, but it's terrible for digital security in Europe. But that's my personal thing, which...
If you allow me 1 second, Thomas, I can reassure you, and I'm completely with you. One also, I love figures. I'm a more data-driven person. Since 2004, since the EU Commission gave fines to the big giants, they gave 23.5 billion in fines to Microsoft, Google, etc. Only 3 have been paid. The net profit of the five big giants in 2021 is 300 billion. Right. So when I hear the Commission saying, yes, the sheriff is in town, now we have a loaded gun, this is all BS, sorry. So we will not win this war but by overregulating. And we need to understand, when Facebook was acquired WhatsApp 2015, the people at DG Comp didn't understand that. When Google acquired DeepMind, probably with a third of the best AI scientists, it went under the radar. So I'm with you. We have 20th century regulation and mindset, and we need to and that's all our job, to overload the technological competencies of our policymakers in Europe. Otherwise, we're doomed.
Yeah, we have one more speaker, but first a two-finger from Alina.
Sorry, just a quick comment on this point that we're talking about. I was with you most of the time until we got to DMA, and then I think what I often hear in Europe, and I'm sorry to be the only, I think I'm one of the only, am I one of 2 Americans on the on the stage here? You know, true, but I will just say that I tend to represent, I think, what the debate is in the U.S. What I find really problematic in Europe is, well, your point, President Ilves, the national security angle does not really make sense to Europeans, and it's a huge divisive issue with the United States, because we are increasingly looking at all digital issues from a national security angle, but that is certainly not the case in Brussels. And 2, I find it really deeply problematic when in the same breath we say Palo Alto is the same threat as Beijing when it comes to tech. I'm sorry, they are not. They are not. There is a normative and values and moral difference between what Chinese technology is, how it's organized, that's state-funded, and that it is an extension of authoritarian policy. That is not what, we have problems with Google, Facebook, and GAFA, whatever, that we can talk about, but they're qualitatively different, and we cannot ever put them in the same category.
Okay, now, moving on to the American point of view and transatlantic issues, we'll have Kaush Arha, if I pronounce that properly, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council, to deal with these issues.
Well, thanks again. And again, good morning and great to be here. And thanks to the LMI folks for gathering us again. And a big shout out to Estonia, I think, for showing the way of how allies can help Ukraine. So I think that's an important thing to say. I would say, I had a few things to say, but I will modulate on what my earlier panelists have said. As Alina has mentioned, that the technology is moving pretty darn fast, faster than what the public can have trust in that technology and what the government can provide some sort of a oversight or rules of the game or whatever. And it's pretty darn difficult when that technology is moving that fast and the technical competence within the government, you heard people here lamenting about how poorly they are situated, to take one technology and say this is how it should be done, left or right. So you're looking more at this juncture, somewhat, as Alina mentioned, not a regulatory, but more of a sort of a rules of the game approach. And in that particular context, the word trust comes up again and again. It's a new thing. It's sort of everybody talks about trusted vendors that our Czech colleagues did at the first Prague meeting. You had our Japanese colleagues at a G20 in 19 talk about data free flow with trust. And so there's a lot of trust out there as the word. And I think one of the framework would be that you would largely look for two sort of trust or assurances from technologies going forward, whatever they may be, AI or quantum or whatever. One would be that very obvious one, that they meet the best industry standards, which is a relatively straightforward purposes. There's an industry threshold that either licenses them or gives them an outline, and you sort of follow it. There's an FDA or ITU or whatever. I think the second part would be what are the legal and the political framework that governs that technology. I think that's an important element that'll come into it. And I think that's implied when people are talking about countries and countries which have a similar sort of rule of law and commitment to democracy and individual freedom. And you heard that in the NATO context in the previous meeting. That applies in the technology context too. And so I think this sort of trusted technology or trusted connectivity, which the Tallinn Digital Summit last year did announce, allowed for this sort of a dual assurances as it goes forward. Now, with that in mind, there are two things that I think the President has talked about, and they're related, but they're somewhat different to be dealt with. One is the digital defense from cyber attacks, largely to Russia in this part of the world, how best we prepare for it. A lot of that discussion may very well be in the NATO context. Some of it may be very well in the EU context or the other transatlantic TTC context. But in America and other places, I think there's another bigger aspect that Alina also mentioned, which is that since there's such a rapidly moving phase of technology which sort of pretty much goes through every part of human activity, what are going to be the global rules that judge it, and how do we set those standards and those frameworks? Slightly sort of a different, related, but a different discussion going on vis-a-vis US and China in particular, and at different level vis-a-vis US, Europe, India, and others. But in this context, I think I do agree with you, the moderator, as he said, that we are going forward now in an era of sort of like-minded groupings, and a fascinating new term that has been added to our lexicon, plurilateral agreements. I think we are in the age of plurilateral agreements. One particular phase of globalization has ended. It was already ebbing through sort of structural impediments in WTO, Ukraine, and the energy crisis and dependence. We heard that you can't be dependent on one country. Similar sort of stuff has been percolating vis-a-vis China at an intermediate level across a lot of sectors. So you're now going into this topic, what Janet Yellen talked about, that we're going to deal into an era of sort of perhaps secure trading agreements amongst people that have a shared commitment to democracy, rule of law, individual freedom. So this era of plurilateral agreements is here. Now, what shape it takes, what particular groupings it's going to have, it's a sort of a fascinating thing, and hopefully one can discuss it a little bit more as we go into discussion. The second is that dealing with technology as a separate topic does both a disservice and I think to some degree is incomplete. It is very much completely embedded into a global economic architecture. So, you know, at the end of the day, what we are talking about is digital goods or digital flows across trade borders. That's what we dealt with trade stuff, especially when, at least at the academic or the government people get together. It'd be a lost thing. We are not engineers to talk about what the finer points of quantum or the finer points of AI are. We're both inequipped at it and we're pretty bad at it. So it is talking about what the rules are, and the rules are inherently sort of what we have determined to be quote-unquote trading architecture. Now it increasingly digital form it takes. And that is a very important thing, because there is this notion somehow that we can do individual supply chain, somehow we can extricate one particular industry, one particular theme, and somehow I will near-shore them, onshore them, friend-shore them, this sort of a, bootstrap this thing somehow. That is inherently inefficient. And how do you do that in 44 parts, go in countries, code an iPhone? I'm not entirely sure how you're going to pick and choose in this. So again, it comes to a framework which lays down those countries that can trade among themselves with a similar commitment to the rule-based order, and those who do not. But that does not preclude that those who do not. It just puts a cost on them to do business with those who do. So I think that's an interesting aspect as we go forward. And within that context, I think we agree and talk about it, but a lot of panelists have said that we are a little bit behind the 8 ball, that America is talking a little bit about China. Europe is equally concerned about being dominated by American Big Five, it was talked about. So there's and so where you have a sort of an American focus more on making sure that Facebook and Amazon and Google and Microsoft have more of a full run of the world, and it's done in a sort of a commitment to, as Alina mentioned, a rule-based order. A commitment and actual application of it, there's a slight gap that one can sort of dig into it, into the regulatory oversight of it. And then Europe and India are more in a situation to be a standard setters, use the heft of the market to say how this could work this way or that, equally directed, as commented, to whether it be state-owned enterprises or private. So fascinating sort of element of how that can be reconciled as we go forward. I'll stop there since he's moving his hands, and we'll go back in Q&A as good.
Not quite. 2 things. I mean, one, Alina wanted to do a poll here, and then I'm going to follow up on that.
Thank you. I'm curious to ask all of you a very broad and general question. This was actually asked during an MSc panel back in February, and I was really surprised with the results, so I'm curious to replicate it with this audience. Okay, so that means you have to raise your hand and listen to the question, okay? So do you think that technology is a net positive for democracy? If you think it's a net positive, raise your hand. Interesting. Obviously, the counter to that, if you think it's a net negative for democracy, raise your hand. Fascinating. If I may.
Some people are not listening.
Very interesting. If I may, quick second question based on our debate here on US and Chinese tech. If you think that US tech is the greatest threat, very general question, do you think US technology companies present the greatest threat to competition, let's say? Yes? Interesting. Do you think that Chinese technology presents the greatest threat? So this is actually the opposite of what the results were. It's a smaller group at the MSc session back in February, which I find really fascinating because it tells us a lot about the different audiences, I think, coming from this part of the world versus maybe other parts of the world. But I'm going to let that sit, and I will let you comment on that.
I just want to sort of focus this back to what this is, which is the conference in general, but this panel as well, which is on security.
Right.
And when we're talking about security and digital things, I mean, I think we can, getting into like, even with the DMA, my concern is security. Let's put it this way, just so we understand what we're dealing with. APT-28 and APT-29, which are the CIA names for 2 hacking groups from Russia, which are also known as Cozy Bear and Fancy Bear. They have hacked the State Department, the DOD, the US Congress, but they've also hacked the Bundestag, the Stiftungen or think tanks in Berlin. They've hacked the Dutch Foreign Ministry, the Danish Foreign Ministry, the Italian Foreign Ministry, and those are foreign ministries that have admitted it. They have even hacked WADA, the World Anti-Doping Agency. And clearly all for, even the WADA shows that why are they doing this? Because it's the national interests of Russia. What that, however, shows to me is that the one adversary does not and in the other adversaries, well, that they don't care about national borders. They don't care about even regional groupings. I mean, they will hack and they will attack countries regardless of their borders. Whereas our approach to digital security remains largely national. There is one group that deals with digital security. Unfortunately, Europe is not in that anymore thanks to Brexit, but I mean the Five Eyes is the one body that actually does any kind of, though I can't say as a non-Five Eyer how much is shared, but the rest of us don't share. And another case of non-sharing is that in 2011, when Estonia discovered a Russian worm in our military network, we went to NATO, our allies, our organization, said we discovered this Russian worm here, and the answer was, oh, you too. This is not the right answer, I hate to tell you. So so one problem is we're still stuck in this kind of national borders, national boundaries, national security, strictly at a national level, on a threat that recognizes no borders. That's one dimension. The other dimension, I would say, is disciplinary, which is that we don't talk to each other about related issues. And I had a personal experience with this when I became sort of concerned several years ago when Eric Schmidt said to me, pay attention to deepfakes, it's coming. And so I said, okay. And then I went to the NATO Center for Cybersecurity in Tallinn and said, well, what are you guys doing on deepfakes? And they said, no, that's content. We don't deal with that. So then I said, okay. And then I went to the Riga Center for NATO Center of Excellence for Strategic Communication, which is the sort of disinformation side of thing. And I said, well, what are you guys doing with this? And they said, no, that's technical. We don't deal with that. So, I mean, we have the national border problem, and then we have the disciplinary problem where we manage not to in any way do any cross-disciplinary activities. And I would suggest that this is a complete disaster when it comes to security if we don't do that. And then finally, I would say this is a point made by Kieran Martin, who used to be at GCHQ and now is at Oxford. But I mean, he really roundly condemns this obsession of the Europeans and the Americans to face off on the issues that they face off on, when in fact one's 500 million, the other's 300 million, and then we have 1.3 billion that is an adversary and doesn't look at national borders at all. And in this case, really, Russia, which may be the primary actor today, at least in the European or transatlantic space on hacking, is actually not a player at all when it comes to tech. I mean, they're a nuisance. They can disrupt all kinds of things, but they cannot innovate. They cannot do anything. They cannot come up with any technology that would be even at the level of either Europe or the United States. And we really have to think, when it comes to technology, we have, be it 5G or AI, I mean, these are all things that we have to look at China, but instead we are, most of the time doing things nationally, and at best, we're fighting with the guys on the other side of the ocean. But with that, I will open it up for questions. Okay. Jarmo.
Thank you very much, Jarno Limnell from Finland. As we all know, war is being fought at the moment in Ukraine, in land, sea, air, space, and cyber. And cyber warfare playbook is rather slim, so we are learning all the time. So my question to you experts is that what is the key point so far that we should learn of the cyber warfare from the Russian side? What has happened in Ukraine?
If I may, thank you very much. the war in Ukraine has not started for Ukrainians on 24th of February. It started 2014, and since then, Ukraine has been target of continuous cyber attacks. In 2014, during those operations on Donbass, false SMS were sent to soldiers, go home, etc. You may remember attack on power plant, which happened in combination with DDoS and false messages being sent and telephone central hacked. So they created short chaos, and Ukraine was adapting to it, and some quite serious attacks happened from Ukraine. I do not recall the name of that specific attack which led to the stop of operation of one of the biggest maritime company. NotPetya, thank you. So Ukraine was 8 years after current stream of testing its fences, and now we see that it's not playing the major part of that, but it's still the complexity of, in the end of the day, the soldier has to walk into the city to occupy it. So it's multi-domain issue. And I think that's the reason why maybe we are asking or having feeling that this is something slim, but it is there. And on the other side, the Russian side was not tested for many years. And therefore, we see that many informations are leaking out. That will be my very simple answer, but there's much.
Yep. In the case of NotPetya, had it not been for one Maersk computer system that was down somewhere in Africa, they would have completely lost everything. But they could rebuild their entire system because one of their computer systems was down in Africa. There's a question there from there's the woman there. Yes, please. Hello. Right there, standing up. Please bring the person a microphone.
Thank you very much. Katja Gershak from Center for European Perspective in Slovenia. It's a great panel. Great, good to listen to you. I want to bring a slightly different challenge, though, and a very practitioner one. A lot of your policymakers or in the think tank community, how much of actual technology and AI do you actually use in your daily work? I think we talk a lot about creating policy frameworks, but how much of it do you use? For example, I know Slovenia is not very well branded on AI, like Estonia is, for example, in digitalization, but we're extremely strong. And even though we fly under the radar, there are now incredible technologies that are being written about in The Economist, everywhere. This is already out there, the ability to actually do policy making based on real-time data that is being updated in real time. And this is data that's out there, it's public. You can scrape it, you can put on top of it the sentiments from social media. When you put this entire framework together, you have a completely different view of what's actually happening in your country and internationally. It's called, I don't want to be too much of a geek, but it's called digital twin. So digital twin is a capability of managing complex systems. So this stuff is already out there. I have no doubts that Estonia is familiar or developing or using. We're doing this in Slovenia now. And there's a capability of doing a digital twin of a country. However, what I'm lacking on this policy level is the fact that there are people sitting in, for example, Mr. Minister, in your office. How much of AI are you actually applying to running your foreign ministry, to actually understanding in real time what is happening out there? Thank you.
I can take that.
You want to answer?
I'm happy to answer that because I think it's we heard a lot about preprints during this pandemic, people publishing their papers. And there's one repository for preprints which is called Archive. And 2 years ago, Archive was actually for sale because it's a little bit like the global internet communities. It's not really public. It's kind of a common good association. And imagine the potential you could have if you could take all the documents which is an archive and trying to understand the trends, the areas which are less covered.
Right.
And the whole idea, and there were Chinese who got interested in buying archive. We tried to mobilize the Europeans. There was very little interest in that. What the minister says is very interesting, because I think this capacity of foresight will need to use these new tools. I mean, I remind you, from minus 20,000 to 2012, humanity created 2 zettabytes. It's 10 factor 21 of data. We are already at 25, and in 2025 we will be at 125. So this exponential age it goes beyond our cognitive capabilities. So if we want to be, again, ahead of the game, and to connect with the question of the gentleman, I wanted just to point one thing on cyber. We should be careful of not looking at the wars of yesterday. Yes, there will be other NotPetyas, but what will come tomorrow is, like the President Ilves says, is at the intersection of different capabilities. And we are very bad, both in research as well as in government, to speak. I mean, I had a discussion this morning on batteries, and I was told, no, that's the resort of research. And, you know, if you don't put together energy, security, and research, I mean, that's where the disruption will happen. Another little anecdote to finish on that. 2 years ago, you didn't get any money for RNA vaccines. Today, if you want to get money to do vaccines for antimicrobial, and you don't do RNA, you don't get money. So how do we inject in our organizations this capacity of planning the unexpected? And I think technology plays a role.
I give everyone a chance here.
Yes. So I was specifically asked how I use AI and new technologies to my policy making. So every day I read Twitter. So as every politician, you know, to see what is the mood in the society. And I'm sure that Twitter has this AI which serves me the proper tweets to read it. So I use AI, maybe not in my control, right?
We're engaged in this new institute called Institute for Tech Diplomacy. So it goes to the heart of the issue right here, that a lot of the foreign policy, or at least government folks, are engaged in what may be tech diplomacy. But tech diplomacy is an undefined term, and so it'd be interesting to define what it is and how do now the new diplomats would engage in this, and especially in this plurilateral agreements that we refer to. Having said that, I do not subscribe to the point that you yourself have to be a technical expert, and because that you can do. I mean, Lincoln wasn't a soldier, but a pretty darn president. Before that here, people talked about how if we had Reagan and Thatcher, we would have been in a better place than we are now. So that is not an engagement that they have to use it or not use it. I would again say, in fact, the people who use tech oftentimes, by definition, tend to be little narrowly focused. So in this broader framework, it is important to look at tech from other, primarily bigger picture than rather a very narrow one. Of course, it helps if you're part of this or not. On cybersecurity stuff, since it's been talked a lot and near dear to the moderator's heart, there is the Ukraine element, which is, I think a lot is being done, not even discussed. The playbook is a little thicker than it seems. But institutionally, we are not prepared as allies or coalition of willing, which has been mentioned here several times, to collectively come up both with the two aspects he mentioned, one of deterrence, other one of punishment. And this is a relevant topic, and this cannot be done till you have interoperability. You refer to Five Eyes. The big issue of Five Eyes is that we share information and we have trust in each other's systems. That is the fundamental element. Without that, it's tough to do everything that we are talking about, a collective cybersecurity. And so when TTC meets, and I think Europe is ahead of this, more like a standard setter than actually dealing with these things, but the Europe setting up the Trade and Technology Council with the US, this would be a topic to discuss. India is far more vulnerable to cybersecurity hack with 1.8 billion people next to China. And last meeting of Leonard Mary, the guy from India here, Samir Saran, mentioned that the funny part was that when India was having the dispute, the border dispute with China and Doklan, that most of the Chinese, most of the bots in Indian telecom social media was actually supporting China on the issue because of the absolute flood of things. So it's a pervasive issue. It is absolutely needs institutional arrangement like the moderator is keen to push at, and it can't be done till you have a broader understanding of interoperability and who the real enemy is, and instead of playing in each other's pockets.
Alina.
Just exactly pick up on this interoperability point, which goes back to your question about how are these technologies, in particular algorithms, which is what AI is, right, are being used in government. I think, frankly, the agencies where these conversations are most current is in the defense departments. Because, of course, for the future of war, there's a lot of conversations happening about autonomous weapons, about kind of drone technology and hive technology and things like that. But there's not a huge amount, from what I can tell, coordination not just across U.S. agencies, but across the alliance. And this is where we hit a problem, because interoperability is not just absolutely critical in the kinetic space. Can tank X work together with missile Y, right? This is the whole point of NATO, frankly, to make sure we have interoperability across the alliance. But I think digital interoperability is just as critical for our future security. And we don't talk about that, because the knee-jerk reaction, as President Ilves absolutely correctly said, is to go back to protection, nationalization. What is going to happen when every country has its own cloud? How are we going to achieve interoperability on AI, which of course relies on data? Like, let's not forget, data is at the core of this, and cloud computing is at the core of data use. But when we have all this regulation preventing our ability to share data across the alliance, when we are all, in Europe anyways, falling into ideas of digital sovereignty, which very similar to the Chinese idea, by the way, how are we actually going to move forward? So it's not that we're living in the last century. In some ways, we're living in the century before that when it comes to how we're thinking about the future of war and how we're thinking about interoperability, not just in the conventional space, but in the future space of digital security.
Right. Just quickly to answer that question on AI, for 5 years, this country has been completely moving over into AI in all government services, and this is the country where there are only 2 things left you can't do online. That's getting married and getting divorced. So that everything, and we won't get AI there anyway, but the point is that, I mean, all kinds of things from court, small claims courts, to taxes are done via AI in this country already now. But if you are interested, I can put you together with the person who is in charge of that. Question was right here. This gentleman here, please stand up so they can see where you are. There you go.
So I'm Tom O'Donnell. I'm here as an energy and geopolitical expert, but I want to say something as a nuclear physicist and someone who worked in some information theory, intractable problems and so forth in the U.S. And complex systems. It's a good discussion to have. I've seen many discussions like this, but it's sort of at a meta level. And the same thing happens in the United States. But in order for Europe to be competitive, you have to have the basic research. And I don't know, for example, I come from the University of Michigan, okay? So it's like number 10 or 12 in the United States. It's ranked higher than any university in continental Europe. You need, the thing is, Europe needs some kind of like a CERN. And what you need is mathematicians trained over a decade or two to get to the level of being in a certain way competitive in new quantum technologies and information theory and so forth. Cyber is one aspect of this. Anyway, to me it's striking. So I think one way in which Europe does very well in this, like I know in the physics realm, is with CERN. And that's a certain model. But physics was always, after the war, absolutely international. Everybody sort of collaborates. You get money from your own government and institutions, but it's absolutely, this way. And a lot of other things, mathematics and so forth, are a little bit like that. But there isn't some center. If there is a center for information theory and so forth like that, something like CERN, maybe Europe can be competitive, is what I'm thinking. Okay. So.
Next question. Back there, yes. Hello.
Thank you. Mark Mullen from Rorschach. The biggest security issue in Spain right now is the possibility, widely believed by a lot of decision makers, that the government of Morocco used Pegasus to tap the Prime Minister's phone, which led him to recognize Western Sahara. We haven't talked about Israel at all, and that seems like, in a discussion like this, an important topic to bring up, and the bigger topic of how a country is responsible for companies within its borders, you know, leaving aside Google and Facebook and the American problem. Thanks.
Anyone want to take that one?
Maybe just one point on the mathematicians. On that, I would gently disagree. It's the opposite. I mean, a third of Facebook AI research in Palo Alto is French scientists. It's even led by a French. So no. I mean,
why are they staying in France?
And the big question is, why do they leave France? So they are there. No, because you seem to see that there's not this. The basic research is there, but you know, again, I mean, I don't want to be labeled as an anti-European. It's exactly the opposite. But there's a famous expression saying, it's because I love Europe that I want it to be changed radically. How come the best people today don't participate anymore to calls for proposals? Because they don't want to fill up 150 pages and wait for 18 months that they call for proposal with a 4% acceptance rate. The European Research Council is a bit the bright spot. And then you have, in this war of talent, these platforms who come. By the way, I did not put it in the same level. I don't want to be shaped in Europe by either or. And by the way, you put China and Europe in the same basket too. I don't want to be put in the same basket than China either. So I think we're on the same page here. And so I think it's a question really of putting that at fruition and at focusing people on a purpose. And last but not least, this topic of national security, I fully agree with the president. I mean, everything has a dual use. And I still have my country like Germany, where most of the AI centers cannot touch anything which is defense, while it's a big hypocrisy because DFKI or Fraunhofer's product end up in missiles or so this is, in order to change, we first need to be lucid about the situation. So I agree with you on the fact that we need to be much more pragmatic and value driven.
A slightly different take on this. Again, there are two things here. One is, can we collectively work on these topics, or do we feel obliged that all of us need to have these particular expertise at home? What you're implying is that there's a need for you know, there should be an MIT here. They may very well be not against it, but I think the beauty is, as was mentioned by you, and is that the free flow of sort of information, particularly in this high scientific area. We came to know about Wuhan because of that very brotherhood of the doctors. Otherwise, left to Chinese, we'd never have gotten it. Then God bless the fellow who made it and then rest in place that kind of succumbed to it. So there's enough engagement there, but there are broader themes. One, I think as a free world collective, we need to make sure that we don't fall back in R&D to China and to patents. That's a much serious discussion than whether Europe has an MIT or not, when all Europeans are very welcome to be at MIT or Google or Facebook. And the second part is going back to a trade discussion which used to have in agriculture. All of us need to be self-sufficient in agriculture. Food security is national security. Now every country needs to be self-sufficient in semiconductors. That is a nonsensical point of view. So again, you'll have to come up with a system that we can allow and benefit from the positive thing of globalization in a plurilateral agreement. I think that's where we need to think more about.
I'd say there's an element we don't ever discuss, which is purely cultural, but it is the determining factor between the United States and Europe, and that has nothing to do even with education. That is the nature of investment, and this is why we're in such deep doo-doo when it comes to European tech. 80% of investment overall in Europe is banking, 20% private equity. It is the reverse in the United States. 80% of investment is private equity and 20% bank. Now, just to figure out what that means, imagine imagine in 1975, a guy comes into Deutsche Bank and he's got long stringy hair. He smells because he said he doesn't believe in bathing. And he walks in there and says, my friend also named Steve and I have in our garage this thing. It's a personal computer, and we don't know whether to call it an apricot or an apple. How long? I mean, it would be 15 seconds before he's thrown out of Deutsche Bank, right? This is a cultural factor that you cannot even legislate this. This is what is the nature of investment, and it has nothing to do with technology because it applies to everything. And that's a bigger problem than we face. I don't know how to change that. Next question, Madam, please stand up with, yes?
Thank you. Hanna Shelest, Ukrainian Prism. We've been talking about digital security, and most of the countries already agreed that cyberspace is the fifth domain of warfare. Are we ready to speak about the digital or cyber offense, not only defense? Now, in Ukrainian case, Anonymous took this responsibility, not only hacking information, but also spoiling activities of, for example, airplanes. Are we ready at the state level, at least to the discussion of these possibilities?
Discussion? No, but please, Alina.
Hanna, you're 100% right. I wrote a paper with Ambassador Dan Fried, who's somewhere in this conference, called Democratic Offense Against Disinformation. But what we actually talk about there is cyber offense capabilities. Because I think it's about time, we don't have to talk about it in public, governments should not talk about it in public, that we deploy those capabilities to respond non-symmetrically to Russian warfare. Because frankly, they've been doing that to us for too long, and we all know about that. And to the point about what have we learned from Russia's war in Ukraine, we've learned that cyber defense does work. Ukraine has been incredibly resilient in the cyber domain. A lot of that has had to do with cooperation and preparedness from the United States and other countries. So to your point about how cooperation is so critical, Ukraine is under constant attack, as you know better than anyone, but it's surviving. And it's in being incredibly resilient, not just as a society, obviously, but also in the cyberspace. But yes, absolutely. I think we have to force the Russians to fight a war on two fronts. And I think what we're learning here is that we have greatly not just overestimated their military capabilities, but also potentially cyber capabilities. Because we were anticipating much more than what they're already doing right now in the cyber domain. So if we force them to deploy on both fronts, I think this will significantly weaken their capabilities in the kinetic domain. Do we have those capabilities in the United States? I think from what I know, that's not classified certainly, we certainly do. Should we be using them to disrupt Russia's military command and control structures, their abilities to carry out a brutal genocide in Ukraine? Yes. I hope those are conversations that are being had right now in our intelligence agencies, but I think Avril Haines may not want to talk about that with us.
No, but two things. One is that we call it active defense. Mm-hmm. We don't call it offensive, just so you get the right terms. And secondly, I think that after the colonial oil attack on U.S. infrastructure, I suspect there is a change of thinking about these issues, but offense is very difficult because are you responding to a real attack or to a false flag attack? These things have to come in now. Next question. Oh, wait, sir.
I
sorry.
wanted to add a little piece of answer on that, and you basically mentioned that now the biggest issue states face is the attribution. And I'm quite happy that EU was able to attribute some of attacks against infrastructure in Ukraine towards Russian state. The Czech Republic helped with that too. So until you are able to properly, in a law way, attribute digital attack, it's quite hard to be looking for consequences. And in regard of those cyber capabilities, as far as I know, every modern army now builds own branch of capabilities, cyber capabilities, cyber attack capabilities. Again, it's a question under which condition and how to use them. Of course, some of actions even happening in the current world, we can suspect that it was done by these branches. So I think the debate if is over. Now the more debate is when and against whom and how, maybe. So it's very vivid thing. And maybe if I may add one point on the debate on technology, because and the future and the ability of Europe to be part of the striving intellectual part of the world, and EU Europe versus America. Alina, you started with the question about technology, and of course, the technology is not connected to values. It's a tool. So once the man in a cave took a stone and he started painting, okay, it was some kind of technology. So there was no ideology or nothing connected to it. But it was technology which was able to create democratic system, democratic society. The technology of sharing information, so we were able to have this huge collective mind. And also it is a technology which is allowing for totalities to rule in a totalitarian way, even though it was pure radio in the beginning of the 20th century, or now internet. So, but in the end of the day, I personally believe in creativity, and the creativity can flourish only in democratic society. So that's what I believe in.
Okay, we have 12 minutes left. I will take 3 questions, one from over there, if there are any hands, otherwise from over there, or from the middle, and then, and please keep them short and no statements. So, anyone over there? Nope. Over here, sir. Yes, you.
Thank you, everyone. Mark Lantain, University of Tromsø. One kind of slow burn issue, which is also starting to appear in the area of cybersecurity, has to do with digital finance. China has made some very impressive advancements over the past few years in its digital renminbi, the ECNY, and this is really starting to be looked at not only from an economic viewpoint, but also for China's ability to potentially erode Western financial power, as well as to potentially avoid the kind of sanctions that Russia is currently experiencing, including having Russian banks kicked off the SWIFT system. So do you see this as a security issue? And one other quick point, 2 countries now accept Bitcoin as legal tender, also a very interesting development. So what are the security ramifications of that? Thank you.
Next. Back there, yes, stand up.
Thank you. Frank Jüris, Estonian Foreign Policy Institute. I would like to reflect back on what was said, that how important is shared threat assessment of coming security threats from the security. And also another one is public awareness. One very good example is from 2017. Core of Estonian internet infrastructure, the backbone of Estonian infrastructure was sold by a Dutch company, Lynx, to a Chinese company, CITIC. There was no public awareness of that at the time. If you do a little bit Googling, you can find out that CITIC is the front company of PLA. And if there is no mention of it in the media, anything like that, then actually the Dutch threatened their own security, because they are the contributors to the NATO Cyber Center in Tallinn. They staff and they fund it. And coming to the awareness, there's another big project going on that is led by the Finnish state-owned company Cinia, that is connecting internet users from Europe, Russia to Asia, and using Chinese technology as well. This puts serious threats to the data security once for all. And of course, impacts also the geostrategic standing of NATO and its allies in the region, because these fiber optic cables can be used for underwater surveillance and anti-warfare, anti-submarine warfare. So how to avoid these similar mistakes taking place in the future? Thank you.
Right, thank you. One more question. Yes.
Thank you, Boris Ruger, Munich Security Conference. One thing that André and I discussed last night was, let's call it tech literacy of members of parliament, members of the administration. Is that an issue in your mind? And if it's an issue, how best to address it? I was, I think a year ago, Stanford and the European University Institute had an initiative where they brought in members of parliament to sort of educate them, including myself. I think it probably failed in my case, but you think this kind of approach is something that should be pursued, and should we invest more in getting decision makers to understand these issues better?
Thank you, Boris. Okay, 3 questions. Digital finance, currencies, the sort of knowledge of what is actually being, who owns what, and finally on tech literacy. Who wants to take what?
I can start.
Alina.
I can start with Boris, if I may. Yes, I think is the answer. Obviously, I think the big challenge we face, not just in the United States, but across democracies, is talent recruitment and retention in the tech space. There was a really relevant and interesting report published by Bob Work and Eric Schmidt, which I think you know about. And they really focused on this particular issue because as governments, we cannot compete with tech companies to compensate these very talented individuals. And frankly, the appeal of public service just for the sake of public service is not what it used to be, the 1950s, 60s, or whenever. So this is a huge problem that we cannot attract tech talent into public service. And it's a generational issue that we really need to be thinking about. The NSA probably doesn't get the best minds out there anymore. I don't know who they get, but I can guarantee that Google probably gets them, and all the other big companies. So one place here that I think we need to be thinking about is how do we actually make public service appealing to these people? Because we're never going to be able to pay them out of taxpayer money what private companies can. I think the problem we face now is that the people who are drafting the legislation we've been alluding to here don't actually understand what they are regulating most of the time. I'm not saying everyone, but the majority, okay, President Lewis can make a blanket statement, but the majority of policymakers don't come from a technical background. Foreign Minister, you have experience in the IT space, but you're, I think, a unique individual as being a policymaker now. But certainly, I think if you took a survey of parliamentarians in the European Parliament, it would be a fraction.
No, don't even think.
A fraction.
Yeah, don't even.
Can I say one last thing?
European, not only European. We'll get to that in a minute.
Can I say one last thing? Which is that to the question about, how do we not repeat the mistakes of the past, we have to bring national security into our investment screening mechanisms. And Europe absolutely has to beef up its investment screening. The TTC is going to be focusing a lot on export controls, which is one part of that coin. But the investment screening part, until we think about it just in economic terms, and we don't have the national security lens, we're going to be repeating the same mistakes. And we're going to leave the space open to Chinese tech in particular. And I think the last thing I'll just say, and then I'm not going to speak again for the rest of the panel, is that Europe wants to lead on tech regulation, right? But to lead on technology regulation, you have to know what you're regulating. And I'm sorry, but you have to lead on innovation. If you don't lead on innovation, you're not going to be a leader in standard setting either. So I think this is where I think we have to start. The regulations should engender the unicorns so that French engineers and mathematicians stay in France because they have opportunities there that they're not coming to work in the big US tech companies. How do we ensure that happens? Well, it starts at the bottom. And I think, unfortunately, we're starting from the wrong end.
Maybe one word for Boris and to connect. Rest assured, in France, is the same thing. In 2018, in August, you know, when nobody is talking about anything, there was a company called Lanxess, which is doing microchips for payment systems. So it's actually linking question 1, 2, and 3, which was acquired by Tsinghua Unigroup. It's even worse than CITIC because that's the investment arm of Tsinghua, which is making all the cadres of the political bureau. And Bruno Le Maire said it's fine. I'm sure he does not like if I say that. But, and that has to deal with, number one, at that time, that was 4 years ago, we didn't understand what's going on in China. Secondly, we don't understand the technologies. And so I would gently disagree with Kaush. No, I think, yes, as a minister, you don't need to know the things. But in this exponential age, I hope I convince you with the data, you need to understand a little bit. Because it's not just something where you can get experts. Look at the conflict we have between the experts and the politician during the pandemic. We need to have people who have a basic. And the good news is that technology is changing so fast that if you're a 20 years expert, the risk is that you're looking back. You need to be learning. And the last point on Boris, we came to the conclusion that you don't change the systems. You know, Machiavelli used to say, don't try to change the system, create something next to it. There is still an incapacity for governments to basically work with, and I don't call it the private sector, this kind of third area, which is the civil society who wants to engage. You know, when I see the European Commission coming to us, small foundations saying, help us recruit program managers, they will never come to you guys. You will not make neither salary nor the agility, etc. But you need to back NGOs, think tanks, foundations, etc. that will do it for you. Otherwise, this talent will never come, and less come. And this is a rethinking of our processes that is necessary.
Kaush.
Sure. Institute for Tech Diplomacy offers that very courses. If you're interested, it's at Purdue. It's a good university, the fifth largest engineering school, so you can do that. I think my colleague there from the stuff that mentioned about, so Alina mentioned the CFIUS, which is investment outside in. Equally important is investment inside out. So we're working on that in the United States in the new bills, especially the new congressional bill, America Compete, to say, hey, a lot of American companies are helping Chinese compete with America. Just you can make this stuff up. On the issue related to, the digital currency, I'm less sanguine. I'm more with Buffett on, whether Bitcoin or crypto, I think is a fad. But the central bank digital currency that you refer to, renminbi and others, that is certainly a way of the future. I mean, that is what we basically do that with credit cards today to some degree. It's turning into a digital. There's a big competition against it. Then the biggest losers would be the credit card and bankers. So it's a political economy is interesting. But I think the U.S. government Fed, when I raised it, we raised it in 2018, 20, Powell couldn't be least bothered. And we were a little complacent saying, dollar, don't worry about it. But I think he's come around now, and others say, hey, we need to look into this. But a broader framework point on this, one is that every time you talk to a tech fellow says, yeah, the people who make policy ought to know more about tech. It sounds great. I think it's fantastic. First, I need to know about tech people making good public policy. I haven't run into that many yet, so that's, doesn't work that particular way. And that'd be a little bit like asking that all the U.S. congressmen and senators need to have a passport to make a comment on foreign policy. That'd be a cold day in hell to do that. So I think that's it. But a broader theme, I'll leave it with this particular context, that in working in all the issues we talk about, whether digital security and the cyber security stuff that our moderator referred to, or about setting up the roadmap of the new digital world, which we are in a pre-Cambrian world, according to Alina, as I agree with. In that context, it is really important that the transatlantic alliance, particularly the US and the EU side of it, come together and engage it in a structured way and not muddy the water with in-between bilateral competition as opposed to a sort of a global stuff. They should do it. I think both needs to be done, but in a structured way. I think hopefully the higher priority is to how do we write this to protect privacy from authoritarian regimes that Technology should advance freedom. That's the tagline, by the way, of the Institute for Tech Diplomacy, that technology should advance freedom. And how does that amount to it? But that does not negate the point, and a very valid one, that you can't just have Facebook and not be unrestricted. And then America has to come up with its own governance system on this so that it has more credibility when it engages with Europe and the rest of the world to say this is the way I ought to do. That's, I think, a legitimate point. And the other thing that I've been talking about, and I think Damon referred to that earlier, is that in this new alliance, it's very important that the Indo-Pacific and the transatlantic countries come together and be the bedrock of democracy and free world. It's unfortunate to use that in two different banks. I think that is a convergence that really needs to happen. And EU is further ahead of them than we are. I mean, it now do a TTC with us, TTC with India, TTC with Japan will happen pretty soon. And I think in this construct, America should be ahead in dealing with the new structure as well.
Every statement from now on will cut into your lunch.
I'll be very short. I don't want to cut you in your lunch. I just ask myself how to orient in all of these ideas and diverging thoughts and good questions without clear way how they will be answered. And for me, one of the beacon which helps me to navigate is so-called human-centered approach to new technologies. Not to forget about ourselves, about our human rights, that the technology should serve to us as a people, that we are still humans, we will be human, we won't evolve as technologies do, and to serve our democratic societies. Thank you very much.
All right. I'll try to answer as well. Digital finance, I don't know. The collapse of the digital currencies in the last week, who knows where it's going to go. On central bank digital currencies, they would be absolutely vital. I predict they will never happen because if you create a central bank digital currency, unless it's in an authoritarian society, the commercial banks will never allow it because they will be completely cut out. And that's why, I mean, we saw it happen. I think it's Sweden. They had a very good idea. The ECB has done a fantastic study on this. It's got a 300-page report on this. It won't happen. It won't happen because it'll kill the banks. Because you can deal. All transfers will be direct if it's a digital currency. So I mean, it's a great idea. I don't think it'll happen. Investment security. You know, this in the technological era, the fact that we don't pay attention to security, especially in the European Union with our own legislation, but we don't have a body looking at the security of financial transactions and of investments is going to kill us, and I don't see that happening. Two more points. We did not mention Taiwan here at all, which is the source of all of the most important chips and is freaking everyone out in the United States and Europe, because if Taiwan gets invaded, we no longer get the best quality chips. And finally, on tech literacy, there's a man named C.P. Snow who was a physical chemist and a literary novelist who gave us the term the corridors of power, which I always thought was Shakespearean, but he invented the term in 1950 or so. In 1959, he published an essay, very dated, but brought out this concept called, the essay is called The Two Cultures. And he talks about how the physicists and chemists would sit at one table at Cambridge and the poets and the novelists would drink at the other table, and he was the only person who could walk between the two tables. That was in 1959 when tech did not play the role it does today. The most technological you probably got as an average person is setting the timing on your your distributor cap. And when I read 1984 in the late 60s, I said, there's no way a television can look at you. Now I cover up my computer. The problem is that we have these two worlds, the tech world, and then we have the political world, and they don't talk to each other. Senator Orrin Hatch, the late Senator Orrin Hatch, chairman of the Finance Committee of the U.S. Senate, asked Mark Zuckerberg, "How do you make your money?" I mean, we are not. I mean, that's at the highest levels of governance, and it's. And then there was the Dutch prime minister, when given a computer, picked up his mouse and started sort of clicking it, thinking it was a remote control. That is where we are.
I would disagree, but we don't have time. Sorry.
No, my point is that you will have one or two people. I mean, I learned to code when I was 15 and I'm 68, so I'm a weirdo. You're probably a weirdo too. The problem is that most
Orrin
people.
Hatch was not a weirdo and asked a very honest and decent question. How the heck does Facebook make money? I don't even know the answer to that myself.
I'll just say the problem is we have tech bros who have no education whatsoever in ethics, democracy, or anything else, just looking to make a lot of money. And then we have people in governance who, I would probably say a very minor number of them ever took a quantitative subject in university. And until we get the people do education for our policymakers in tech and math and science, and until we get the tech bros to have like mandatory, education in ethics, kind of like diversity courses in U.S. universities, it's not going to happen, and that's going to be a perpetual problem, and we'll leave that to the next generations to solve.
That's the Jedi's, Toomas. That's the Jedi.
That's the Jedi.
We're on the right side of the Force.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Have a good lunch. We should be back here, at 4, 3?